Okay, today's daf is Masechta Bava Basra daf Pei Gimel number 83, and we're gonna start from daf Pei Beis Amid Beis about like 4 lines, 5 lines where it gets wide on Pei Beis Amid Beis. I'm gonna make it bigger, but basically, I'm just pulling up the picture over here, and you see in the picture over here, we learned in the Mishnah that if you buy three trees, so then you not only bought the trees, but the price includes the land underneath the tree, the land in between the tree, okay, the land in between the trees, and around the perimeter of the tree. So we discussed that yesterday, but now we discussed the land in between the trees. You suppose you bought three trees, but they're spread out from each other about 300 yards each, so then you buy the land in between, you just bought three trees. So we're going to learn that there's a minimum shear that they have to be separated and a maximum shear. In other words, the minimum shear means there can't be two trees right next to each other, because if they're so close to each other, you're going to uproot one tree because they're interrupting the growth of the other tree. So one tree is not as is almost as if it's not there. And if it's too far away from each other, then certainly you didn't buy the land in between the trees. So we're going to learn that there's a maximum shear. What's the maximum shear that's in between the trees? So let's get started over here. Okay, here we go. There we go. Dr. Gemara. Okay. So the Gemara says 5 lines from the bottom. 5 lines from where it gets wide. Let me just get my pointer. Bekama yehei beneim. How much does it have to be between the two trees? How much space should be between the two trees? So we're going to have a machlekes between Rav Yosef and Rav Nachman. Rav Yosef says, Rav Yehuda Shmuel. Rav Yosef heard from Shmuel that's me'arba amas. A minimum of 4 amas has to be between the trees. V'ad shmoina until 8 amas. Rava Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. Rava, in the name of Rav Nachman, who heard from Shmuel. So Rav Nachman heard from Shmuel. Mishmoina vad shesresrei. That Shmuel said, really from 8 till 16. So the question is, what did Shmuel say? Now we know Rav Yosef was not sure of his learning, because he lost his mind somehow in the between, and Abaye used to have to remind him. So Amalei Abaye Rav Yosef, so Abaye politely says to Rav Yosef, you're saying over in the name of Shmuel 4 amas till 8 amas, letiflik al Rav Nachman. Don't argue on Rav Nachman's version of Rav Shmuel said, because there's actually a Mishnah that corroborates what Rav Nachman said. Why? It's now we learned in the Mishnah, and now there's the halacha that we learned, the mitzvah that we learned last week's parsha of you're not allowed to plant klayim next to a kerem. Kerem is a vineyard, but what defines a vineyard? How many vines? So the way a definitive look of a vineyard is 2. You have to have. Imagine you have 4 vines with 1 vine sticking out, one extra vine, so a total of 5, with 1 as a tail. Let me see if I could pull a picture up here. Here's the picture. You have 5 vines. That defines a vineyard right over here in the picture. Now the question is, once you have a vineyard, you cannot plant near it. You have to really, really distance away from it. So the Mishnah says that, let's say you have a row of vines, and there's 16 amas in between them. So it's not a vineyard, because there's such a far distance in between them. It's not defined as a vineyard, and therefore you can plant something in between. It's not a problem. It's not klaya kara. The Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, you plant your vineyard by 16 amas. Each row is 16 amas. You're allowed to plant something in between. And not only that, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Maisa bet Salmoin, there's a story in this place called Salmoin. Somebody actually did that. He planted a vineyard, 16 amas via 16 amas, every 16 amas. But the problem is the vines grew, so they minimized the 16 amas in between. So, but there have to be more than 16 amas to be considered not as a unit. So in order to minimize that, in order to do that, L'shana acheres hayohiv esei mekayim azera v'zera esabur v'ol ma'asav nechama v'hitiruhu. Basically, in between, he put all the vines, the branches of vines for the in between. And the outer side already had 16 amas in between because all the branches were facing inward. So he planted that 1 year on the outside of the rows. And the next year, he picked up the branches and pulled it in the other direction, in the opposite direction. So there was 16 amas in between. So that's not a vine. And he planted another plantation, let's say wheat, in between. Let me see if I can have a picture up here. Here, 16 amas by 16 amas. So every 16 amas. So what he did was, and you're not allowed to plant another in another next to a vine. You're not allowed to plant other crops like wheat, the barley. So basically, 1 year. Here's the picture. 1 year he pointed all the branches in between and planted on the outer space. The next year, he pointed the branches in the other direction and planted in between. So as long as he separated and made sure that there's a 16 amma separation between the vines, that was enough to be considered as a vineyard. The point over here is that if there's a separation from the Mishnayos and Klaim, it implies that if there's a separation between tree to tree of 16 amas or more, then it's not considered one unit. So we see, like Rav Nachman said, that in order for two trees to be considered as a unit is only if they fall in between 16 amas. So exactly like Rav Nachman said, Rav Yosef said, no, if they're just more than 8 amas away from each other, and they're not considered one unit. So Rabbi said to Rav Yosef, don't argue Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman seems to have heard better from Shmuel than you did, because the Mishnah seems to corroborate the opinion that it's the shear is 16 amas, not 8 amas. Amalei, so Rav Yosef defended himself. He said, Ano lo yadana, I really don't know. Maybe he said, I don't know this Mishnah. El uvda havda, but I saw a story by another great rabbi. We go to Amid Aleph, Bidura de Ravasa, in the city of shepherds, that a person sold to his friend 3 trees, and there was no 8 amas in between them, and he didn't know if that is considered that you bought the land in between. They came to Rav Yehuda, and he said, Zil havle kamoy v'akar v'kelev. Make sure that if there is a place where a cow can go, or let's say an ox can go with its plow equipment in between, then if there's at least, if there's not minimum, then that shear, then you have to give him the land. I didn't understand what the size is how wide is a cow or a ox with the plow equipment. Kivan Shmaitzer Lahod Tana Layita Adam Ilam Samach Stechaveram came Hichamen Dala Amis, Vatana Law Dala Amish Amru Kidei Avoidis Karim, Amina Shmamina Kabbalai Baka Vakela Dala Amis. So he proved from another Mishnah that the width of an ox with its plow equipment, the width is 4 amas. So now Rav Yosef saw this story. So he said like this, the minimum shear between the 2 trees has to be, like Rav Yehuda said, of 4 amas. If it's less than 4 amas, you didn't buy the land. It's too crowded. It has to be at least 4 amas separation between one tree and one tree. So since Rav Yehuda said the minimum shear is 4 amas, then if we double that, then the maximum shear that the 2 trees can be separated is 8 amas, not 16 amas. So it's the minimum is 4 amas, that they have to be at least 4 amas separate from each other, but they cannot be 8 amas more than each other. And when Rav Yosef observed what Rav Yehuda paskin, Rav Yosef said that must mean that I believe that Shmuel held the same way, that the minimum shear is 4 amas, and the maximum shear is 8 amas. Rav Nachman, on the other hand, he heard from Shmuel that the trees have to be separated at least by 8 amas, and not maximum, and the maximum is 16 amas, almost like the Mishnah in Kalayim. So as the Gemara, why did Abaya jump against Rav Yosef? Because he said, don't argue against Rav Nachman, because the Mishnah in Kalayim seems to corroborate what Rav Nachman said, that the maximum shear is 16 amas. Wait a second, Rav Yosef Milaytnam, isn't the Mishnah over there agreeing to Rav Yosef also? Because at the end of that Mishnah it says, Rab Meir, Rab Shimon, Rab Meir, Rab Shimon says, Karmai Shmoina al Shmoina Mutar Lahavi Zera Sham. That according to Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Shimon, the maximum shear, what makes something a unit is if it's less than 8 amas, but if it's more than 8 amas separate, then it's considered as 2 separate units. So we see that Rabbi Meir corroborates the opinion that the maximum shear is above 8 amas. So that's exactly what Rabbi Yosef said. So we have a Mishnah agreeing to Rabbi Yosef, because Rabbi Yosef could say, I'm going with the opinion of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. So the answer is, Abaya did not like that, because Rav Yosef should not be paskening like Rav Meir of Shimon. And that's why Abaya has a question against Rav Yosef, because Afilahochi Mai Sa'adav, the story, the Chachamim brought an actual story that corroborates that the opinion is 16 amas. They actually brought Maisa B'Tzalman. In that Mishnah, they said Maisa B'Tzalman, Rabbi Yehuda, who's a Tana, brought a story in Salman that the story was with 16 amas. So Rav Yosef should have went with the Chachamim of that Mishnah, not like Rameh Reb Shimon. So the Gemara just finishes up a few loose ends over here. Bishlama, it makes perfect sense. The Rav Yosef, I'll leave it to Rav Shimon. According to Rav Yosef, who went with Rav Shimon. So again, Rav Yosef's opinion is the 2 trees have to be separated a minimum of 4 amas and a maximum of 8 amas. Then it's considered 1 unit, and that's you bought the karka. Shamina le mefuzarim. We see that Rav Shimon holds it can't be too far more than 8 amas. V'shamina le ritzufin, and we see that it can't be closer than 4 amas. Mefuzarin hada amen. We see Rav Shimon's opinion is that shmoina amas, like we said before, is it can't be more than 8 amas separate from each other. We just saw that. And ritzufin, we say Rav Shimon holds it can't be too crushed in together. The Tanan. We learned in the Mishnah, kerem hanatu al pochas midala amas ein a kerem divrei Reb Shimon. Or a kerem that's planted so close together. Let's say all these vines, right? These vines are planted less than 4 amas to each other. That's not a vineyard. It's not a vineyard because you're going to eventually uproot something there. So according to Reb Shimon, if it's planted so close together that there's less than Dalet Amadis in between, it's not considered a vineyard. Divrei Reb Shimon. Said, that is considered kerem. And if you have a bunch of vines in between, we imagine they don't exist anymore. But the vines on the outer side are enough to make a kerem. So therefore, if there's a separate from the outer 2 vines of more than Dalet Amas, that's considered to be enough to make it a kerem. But the bottom line is, you see this idea that Reb Shimon holds something that's crowded in less than Dalet Amas is not considered 1 unit. It has to be a little bit separate. So Reb Yosef could align himself perfectly with Reb Shimon, that the shear of 3 trees is 4 amas. It can't be closer than 4 amas to each other, and can't be more than 8 amas. Fine. Ella, Rav Nachman held like the Chachamim, Alib de Rabbanim. So Mifuzaran, Shamin Lay, from the rabbis, if they hold like the Chachamim say the maximum beyond 16 amas, it's not considered 1 unit. That we see that clearly in that Mishnah. But Ritzufin, Mishamin Lay, where do we see that according to the Chachamim, the shear that it can't be closer to each other, it can't be more squished than 8 amas? Where do we see that? I mean, we only see a Mishnah that describes the maximum shear, but we don't see a Mishnah, according to Rabbanim, that describes the minimum shear. So the Gemara says, that it's just logical inference. Midl Rab Shimon Palga, Rabbanan Nami Palga. Since Rab Shimon holds, it goes in halves. It's the minimum is 4 amas, and the maximum is 8 amas. And the Rabbanan say the maximum is 8 amas, so they must hold that the minimum, it has to be separated by 8 amas. So the maximum is 16, so they hold that the minimum has to be 8. It's half. Rava totally disagrees. Hilchas the halacha is me arba amas vat sheish esrei. The minimum that the 2 trees have to be separated from each other is 4 amas. But what's the maximum that can be separated from each other? That's 16 amas. So Rava gets the best. Tanya Kavasi the Rava, and this is what we said, Rava. Kama Yehik Mikrovin. How close do the three trees have to be? So let's go back to the picture of the three trees, right? So in order to buy the land in between, Rava says the minimum has to be that there's 4 amas distance from each other. The maximum is 16 amas. And if it's anything, if it doesn't fit into that number, then you didn't buy the land, and you didn't even buy the land underneath the tree. So if the tree dries up, you can't replant there. That's exactly what this price says. House distance, if you fit into these parameters, you bought the land underneath the tree, and the trees in between, and even if they have small trees in between, that's yours because you bought the land in between. Therefore, if the original tree that you bought dries up or got cut down, or let's say a hurricane blew it down, you own the land, so you can replant the new tree. But if it's less than that, or yes, more than that, you bought it one after another, you bought nothing, and you just bought a tree. If the tree dries up, you don't have no land, and you can't replant over there. So that ends this particular sugya of the Gemara over here. Okay. By the way, this is the ox with its plowshare, and that is a distance of 4 amas. Okay, let's go over here. Now we're going to bunch of questions and answers. Boyer Rabbi Yirmiyah, we had a question. When you're measuring the 4 amas, mimakam katzer humaydin or mimakam rachav humaydin, from the widest part of the tree or the narrowest part of the tree. See, if you measure the dalet amas, does it have to be from the tree top or from the tree bottom? Because when you measure from the tree bottom, so then, they have to be closer to each other because there's a further distance, as you can see in this picture over here. From the tree top you're measuring, or you're going to be measuring from the tree bottom. The answer is going to be you measure from the middle of the tree. That's the answer. So the answer is Amalei Rav Gviya Mebeksil Rabashi. Rav Gviya said Toshma the Tanan Aruchuva Shebegafen Einamoide El Meikar Sheni. So this has to do with grafting of a vine, and you only measure from the middle knot. Okay, so in the middle knot somewhere from over here. So you have 3 parts to this plant, and if you're measuring to get away from this vine, which is consists of taking an old vine, grafting it with a new vine. So anyway, you have to make sure not to plant wheat. You have to separate it a big distance, and you measure it from the middle of the plant, the middle of the vine. Anyway, so the bottom line is the question answered. When you measure the 4 amas distance, do you measure from here, the top of the tree, or the bottom of the tree? The answer is you measure it from the middle of the tree. By Rabbi Yirmiyah said, you sold him 3 trees, right? But they're coming out of 1 tree. See, sometimes you have 1 tree that looks like that's really 3 trees. Here's 1 tree, right? But underneath the ground, these 2 branches started to grow roots. So you see the picture over here? When you originally had 1 tree, then somehow it had 2 branches on the trunk, and then land filled up, and they became out like 2 separate trees. Now it looks like you have 3 trees over here. And let's say you meet the other requirements. Did you buy the land in between? Are they considered 1 tree? Or since there's roots starting to grow from each of the branches, are they considered as another separate tree? As you can see in the picture. Amalei Rav Gviya Mebeksil L'Ravashi Tashman the Tanan Mabrak Gimel Vam Bikrin Nirim Abelazar B'Shimon Rabelazar B'Tzadik Ayme Yesh B'Neim Dal Am Shmonim Mitzdarfim L'Aim Ein Mitzdarfim. So according to Rabelazar B'Rab Tzadik, if you graft, the same idea of the grafting, and they're connected somehow underneath, so then they're considered as separate entities. That's the point. They're considered as separate entities. They're not considered as 1 vine tree. They're considered as 2 separate vine trees. So this is going to be considered as 3 separate trees, this picture, and therefore you bought the land in between. That's what the Gemara says. Boy Rapapa. Rapapa said, a question. You sold 2 in your field. The Echad Alametza, but one of them was on the border of the field. Maho. Let's take a look at the picture. You have you bought two fields, two trees. Okay, two trees, and one is on top of the border wall. I don't know how this works. So is it considered three trees, or once it's on the border wall, it's not considered connected with the two trees? What happens? Shnayim b'soich shaloi ve'echad b'soich shel chaveira. Mao. Teku. Let's say a guy owns two trees on one side of the border, right? Then on the other side, in his friend's field, he happens to own a part of his friend's field because he bought three trees in his friend's field. So he's selling one tree from that to join with the two trees that he's selling in his own field. Do they combine to become three trees? Teku leaves that unresolved. We go to Pegim. Ravashi says, let's say you bought three trees, but let's say there's a pool, a pit full of water. Does that separate them so they're not considered three trees? Or amasamayim ma'ushatafsik, or let's say you have a canal or moving water that's running in between. Does that separate that into that's not three trees anymore? Risusarabimau, let's say you have a thoroughfare, you have two trees, you own a field, both sides of Central Avenue. Two trees on one side, one tree on the other side. And the Shusarabin is dividing it. Do you combine the three trees? Or richba dediklamau. Or let's say you have a bunch of palm trees that are just combined to each other, that they put up it becomes like a wall in between the two trees to the third tree. Teku, the Gemara leaves this unresolved. The Gemara asks, Hillel asked the question from Rebbe. All the errors beinehu mahu. Let us say you bought three trees and another cedar tree grew in between. So is that your tree? So the Gemara says, what kind of question? If you bought three trees, you own the land in between the trees. So then certainly you own the cedar tree in between. Allah, b'shusa dedei nafek. It grew in your land. So certainly you own the cedar tree coming out. No, the question is like this. The same question. You have three trees, but in between two of the trees to the one tree, there's a big cedar tree that's interrupting the view, let's say. Hoya eres b'neya mao. Would a cedar tree be an interruption to divide up that you're not buying three trees, that they're considered separate entities because there's another cedar tree in between? Amalei. So Rebbe said, kana v'kana, it works. You bought it. It's fine. Okay. Here's Richard Dikla, and let's go over here. New question. Now you said we bought three trees. Now I'm always showing you the picture of the two trees. If you look closely at the picture, I'm always showing you the picture as three trees in a segoil. Look like one and one in between. But the Gemara's question is, it's not so simple. How are the trees standing? Rav says, Kishur, they can even stand like in one row. You bought three trees in one row. So even though there could be a great distance from the first tree to the third tree, that's considered buying three trees and you bought the land in the between. And Rashbam gives you the picture. Shmuel says, it's like a segoil, like a three on a dice. If it's like a line, certainly you bought the three trees if it's like a segol. The one that says it's like a segol, if it's like a one row, then you didn't buy the trees. My tama mishum demizdarai ben tayo, because when it's like a segol, it's very difficult to plant in between. You see the picture over here, when it's a segel, it's very hard because the two trees are near each other and they're just crowding itself in. So you can't plant in between. Then you bought the land in between. But if it's like a row, you could plant between one tree and two trees. If they're in a row, you will be able to plant. So therefore, maybe the seller did not sell the land in between. Maskef lo Rav Amnuna, according to Rav Amnuna, asked the question, the one that said that it's like a row, it's because you can't plant in between. Let us say this way. Let's say the three trees are such trees that that grow a lot of thorns in between, and therefore, if you can't plant in between, Hachinama, you're going to say the yeshlei karka, that you have karka. Let's say if you according to the Mandiyama that you need a segel, But let's say you planted in a row, but the type of trees that you planted in a row are type of trees you can never plant in between, because once you start moving in between the trees, you're going to be scratching yourself on the thorns of the trees. If it's those type of trees, you're going to say, oh, you actually karka, you do have karka. Amalei. So Rav Huna responded, Hanach chashive, Hanach chashive. You need, in other words, in order to buy the land in between, you need two things. Number one, you have to have trees that are important, chashav trees, not thorny trees. And also, it has to be that you can't plant in between. But if the tree that you're buying is not a chashav tree, I don't care which way, how its formation is, if it's a segel or a straight line, you didn't buy the land in between. It has to be a very important tree, and it has to be in this formation of a segel. And that is the opinion of Shmuel, but Rav says they could even be in a row. Okay, we will continue with the Mishnah tomorrow, Be'ezus Hashem.
All right.